Nau mai, hoki mai ki a fold, e mihi nei ko Duncan Greive toko ingoa. This is another monopod. I hope that's all right. That's two in quick succession. It wasn't meant to be that way, and I'll sort of explain why in a vaguely circuitous way. But broadly speaking, I wanted this to be a sort of an election-relevant podcast, and that's what it's going to be about on some level, but it's not the way I had hoped it would go. It's no great controversy or anything, but I do think the sort of circumstances around it are kind of interesting. So I'll talk a bit about why it's just me and then about why I think that's a bit of a problem. So anyway, earlier this week, I watched a media debate on Zoom. It was staged by Better Public Media, which is a local, I guess it's kind of a lobby or advocacy group that was set up in the aftermath of, older listeners will remember, the great TVNZ7 wars. This was a digital channel that was set up under Helen Clark's Labour government to do the kind of more public broadcasting oriented work that was hard to place and fund under the in the commercial realms of TVNZ1 and 2. And it had that kind of less popular but more sort of public-spirited content, shows about, arts and culture and the media and that kind of thing that just don't naturally fit on commercial TV channels. All well and good. National come in and did as National tends to do and basically told TVNZ that they didn't have to do it, and TVNZ said, right, we're not going to do it. So Better Public Media, that's what it came out of, and it's become an organisation that advocates to politicians to just have a lot more public media created in this country. They make some really good points. We do have on a per capita basis a lot less public media made than other countries. Here our public media is basically RNZ and to a certain extent parts of what happens on the more commercially funded TVNZ and in some ways Whakaata Māori too. But we basically operate a decentralised version of it, which and just fundamentally the budgets are lower. And regular listeners to this podcast will know I think our system is pretty innovative. It's pretty good, but it is undeniably much, much less funded than other similar countries typically do. The thing about Better Public Media is that they do have a position. The opening speech by Miles Thomas on Monday night had a pretty strong, contained a lot of strong statements. It described commercial media as a disaster for democracy and said that it had essentially like a pro-right wing bias sort of baked into it, things that both commercial media and the National Party would sort of disagree with. That's if that's your thesis, then you can't necessarily be surprised when you put on a debate that not everyone shows up to the debate. They might not feel like they necessarily get a fair hearing. And that's the way it proved. So the debate was attended by Jenny Markroft from New Zealand First, who was pretty good, and by Ricardo Menendez-March and Willie Jackson from the Greens and Labour respectively, who had their moments, but broadly it was let down by the fact that there weren't a lot of people. So they largely agreed with one another, and there wasn't a perspective from either National Act, who are the two parties likely to be the biggest part of the next government, or Te Pāti Māori. What I found frustrating about that was that I think the media is actually in a pretty dangerously poised state and has been for sort of 15 odd years, but there have been moments of sort of stability, but we're going through a bit of a realignment at the moment. And, some of this I'll have touched on relatively frequently, but I think maybe bottling it up into one sort of thesis is potentially worthwhile. But before I get into that, I just want to sort of talk about what I had intended to do. So after watching that debate, I wrote a piece about it, expressing dissatisfaction with the sort of quality of the debate and the narrowness of it. And Toby Manhire, host of Gone by Lunchtime, former editor of the Spinoff, current editor-at-large of the Spinoff, brilliant writer in mind, suggested something that I should have thought of a long time ago, to be fair, which was to get Melissa Lee, National's broadcasting spokesperson, and Willie Jackson onto the fold and have a more substantial or at least more, have it with a bit more kind of product differentiation debate on some of the issues that I think are impacting media. I basically took it as read that I could get Willie involved. He and I have had our disagreements over since he's been broadcasting minister. One thing I absolutely cannot fault him for is his availability. He's even when he has kind of pugilistic encounters with journalists, that his background in media and I think his general disposition is to sort of show up and have a robust conversation. So I first went to Melissa Lee. She was the one who didn't come to the Better Public Media debate. I've had probably just as much contact with Melissa as with Willie over the last few years. We've caught up for coffee. We've had long phone conversations. If ever I see her, we'll have a chat. So there's very perfectly cordial relations on all sides, and all she did was not reply to a text, So let's not kind of over egg this thing. It might just be that there's any number of reasons why that might not have happened, and she might have been not able to make it happen because her schedule is mapped out well in advance because there's a freaking election campaign on. So I'm not particularly mad at it, but it seems to me that both the debate itself, the level of interest, and the sort of inability for me to get any kind of engagement there is a little bit of a cipher for where media, broadcasting, etc., is in this election campaign and just in the political mind at the moment. It's always very hard. Just take it as a given that it's hard for media to cover media. You're obviously talking about yourself. You're talking about your own book, and that's always an awkward dance to make. The thing I try and do with this podcast is to talk about media in a very broad sense, and any kind of way that there is a kind of a mass communication medium across a whole realm of things, and I think if you take that, so that includes everything from TikTok to video games to newspapers to streaming TV to all of the social media platforms and private messaging ones too. And I think if you have that kind of perspective, then you get a sense of the scale and the impact of the industry. And it's the scale and impact of the industry that functionally is why the locally domiciled, professionally made content part of it, what we would have traditionally understood as the media, is in such a state. And so, so I want to just talk a little bit about why that is and why I think that the political environment, the absence of any kind of interest in it from like a prominent politician. There isn't anyone I can think of, I hope I'm wrong, who has a big joined up thesis around this the way that you see some politicians in the US and the UK and in a number of other countries doing. Before I get into that, I just want to quickly acknowledge that under this term of the Labour government, we've seen the Public Interest Journalism Fund, and we have seen, during the COVID era, a lot of suspension of courtier fees and a lot of facility to kind of give temporary relief to particularly the major local media companies. There was a lot of spending went on through the COVID campaign, some of which felt like it was a sort of backdoor way of supporting the major media companies, and also the news bargaining code, which is currently before Select Committee and may or may not survive a change of government, but at the very least it's a serious legislative attempt to solve for at least the news part of the problems, some of the problems confronting here. So it's not like nothing's been done at all, but in some part, because there were issues with parts of that, I think there's been a level of maybe a kind of exhaustion with the media is always talking about what trouble the media is in. And that's very fair. Like all industries are challenged, or a lot of industries are challenged, and change tends to kind of have impacts on some businesses that are negative and others that are positive. And generally, well, that's how markets work. The reason why I think you have to consider media as a bit of a special case is the same reason that we've got a ministry for it, when, even though it's a relatively small industry. Like the news media narrowly is called the fourth estate. It's considered a vital part of a functioning democracy to have a scale, pluralistic news media that covers the government in a very broad sense to make sure that everything, as sort of a natural tension on it. And so when it shrinks and withers away, which has been happening. We employ far less journalists than we did 10 or 15 years ago. That's naturally should be seen, can be seen certainly as as democracy becoming a bit more fragile, a precondition for something kind of gnarly to happen there. But again, speaking to that sort of expansive definition of media, when you have, if you think about the kind of all of the cultural elements that knit your society together that historically came through radio, television, magazines, now that all of those things are challenged and in the process of moving digitally become a lot less accessed by local audiences, you can see that there is obviously a sort of a big fundamental shift that's happening that deserves and requires a level of thinking from government if they want to sort of, if they believe that the arguments that led to the setup of New Zealand On Air or having ministries for culture and heritage, for the government owning TVNZ, if all of these things mattered historically, surely they matter still. And the reason why media is so challenged, and I think in actually a more perilous state than we like to admit, and again, another tension, commercial media is the most challenged. It also has the least incentive to publicly admit that because its whole business is selling advertising. And when you're selling advertising, you don't want to be saying, hey, we're in a bit of a state right now. You want to be saying, God, things are going great and our audience is bigger than ever. So you just have to kind of live with that tension that exists and is peculiarly sensitive within this industry. So the big shift, along with going digital and audiences atomizing and algorithms serving up a kind of bespoke media diet to every single person on earth, there's been a big shift behind that, which is a move from advertising that was kind of video or display based and very mass market to what's called performance marketing, whereby a business organization pays on the basis that a business objective happens as a result of their advertisement. The canonical example of that is Google search advertising, but now you see it everywhere. Like Amazon is a $30 billion search business. DoorDash is a $750 million ad business. Facebook and YouTube are performance marketing businesses. Basically, all of the digital tech giants, for the most part, have huge advertising businesses which are driven by matching their huge data sets to having consumer intention matched to a business objective. So the previous form of advertising has just kind of become a less and less important part of business strategy. Now, I think there's a mistake there, to be honest. The performance marketing, to me, should more correctly be conceived of as digital rent. Like that's the sort of cost of setting up shop. And I still think there is a place for brand and for understanding those things differently. But for the moment, where we are now, those are considered the same budget, and whereby someone can see this thing produce this result and this thing has a less inherently testable thing. There's just a gravity towards the data that has existed there. And what that means is that all of the companies which produce local culture, from TVNZ to Warner Brothers Discovery with their 3 brand, to organizations like ours, to NZME, to Stuff, they're all, as well as having, for the most part, their traditional linear television or newspaper kind of revenue stream sort of whittled away as audiences migrate to digital, there's also this kind of move away from the kind of products they sell to the kind of products that technology companies sell. And the government is a big part of that. Like, remember, they're a massive, 9-figure client of the likes of Google and Meta as well. So, and this is setting aside another huge piece of the puzzle, which is that, as we alluded to with Where Are the Audiences a few weeks ago, younger audiences in particular, but also all audiences, having been trained to get their information, their entertainment through social media apps, through user-generated content apps, that is just, it takes an ever-increasing share of audience, but there, with a few relatively narrow exceptions, there's almost no monetization option for news producers on those platforms. The people who make money out of those platforms are mostly the platforms themselves, and certainly not enough money to justify heavy investment in creating news and entertainment content specifically for those platforms. So you have this twofold problem of an erosion of revenues towards the creation of original content, whether that's news or entertainment that is specifically of and about this country, and you have a distribution problem that means that audiences are increasingly likely to see content and consume content and news and whatever you like from all over the world rather than here. And that's basically like a sort of a top line of the challenges facing the local media market. Now, these aren't like turn off the lights tomorrow problems, I don't think. And there are plenty of really good news stories about it. Coming out of this sector, there are amazing kind of content creators out of New Zealand that have got global audiences. There are New Zealand ad agencies that are creating campaigns for tech giants around the world that are, because of the quality of their work. Like, I'm not a sort of a doomer on this environment. I wouldn't have started the Spinoff if I thought it was, if there was no hope out there. But I think that the stuff matters. Like, we're quite fortunate. Like, this election, as gnarly as it's been at times, certainly it's much less so than the political environment, the general kind of socio-political environment that you have in the UK. We don't have riots in the streets the way they did in France over their summer. The absolute chaos in the US where, Steve Bannon has Matt Gaetz on his kind of weird podcast, and then he's bouncing the speaker from the House of Representatives for having the temerity to avert a government shutdown. Like, it's really, really crazy out there. And I personally believe that is because of the chaotic media environment. And I'm not saying this is a simple solve or that the only answer is to shut it down or regulate the hell out of it. But government is supposed to look at these things and think deeply about them and try and design solutions that kind of get us to a better place. And I think media is, just like housing is a platform that impacts health and education in really profound ways, media is a platform which influences what is politically possible, what our sort of social and environment and the way that we relate to one another. It's pretty important stuff, I think. And, setting aside my own and the Spinoff's own and even the whole of the media's interest in the media just perpetuating itself, not growing astronomically, but just being able to kind of operate in a sort of functional ongoing capacity, it would just be really nice if there were people in senior levels of politics who were sort of thinking about this, because it really does impact their jobs too, I think. And that's what this sort of comes down to, is like, if you want to be able to basically advance a more kind of pure and sophisticated version of any of your platform so that you can help this country become, fix what ails it and become what you believe it can be, having a sort of a functioning media that doesn't have its hair on fire at all times is probably a good thing. So it would have been cool to have this conversation with Willie and Melissa. I'm truly not blaming Melissa for that. Like I sent a text, like genuinely. But it would have been great to know what they think and to sort of have a conversation of this nature. Maybe it'll happen in the aftermath of the election. There are certainly, like I said, Jenny Markroft, who I also spoke to in the aftermath of the debate. She was working at Today FM when it went down, so she knows how challenged the media is in a very kind of first-hand way. So it's not like there's no one, thinking hard about this, and there certainly are people in other parts of government at the likes of the Ministry of Culture and Heritage and the Broadcasting Standards Authority, New Zealand On Air, and so on. I'm not a doomer, I swear, but I do think it just deserves more attention than it's getting, and it would have been nice to have the chat ahead of the election. Anyway, that's my big thesis. Sorry that it was another monopod, but I will be back next week with someone else. I'm really confident and hopeful about that. I want to thank oMedia for making this podcast possible. I'm so grateful for that. And also to Samuel, who let me, another reason why this happened, if I'm honest, is because I got really, really deep in a feature on New Zealand First Shane Jones, which it's just actually up on the Spinoff now, and it kind of sucked all of my energy and my attention. Samuel was very gracious in just letting me do that and then letting me do this. So appreciate you, Samuel. So thank you for listening to The Fold. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oMedia, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oMedia for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.